history, but it actually only got its name, Wenceslas Square, in 1848. Prior to that, it had the much less ceremonious name, Horse Market. That's because this is where they used to buy and sell the horses. Up the far end, there's a big statue of Wenceslas III on his horse, and behind that is a very, very, very impressive building. Don't be fooled by the perspective. This square is enormous, and that building is absolutely massive. It's a national museum. It's one of those museums, though, that the actual. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. It's one of those museums that it's a lot cooler to look at the building on the outside than it is to actually go and visit the exhibition on the inside. You see, it's a museum of natural history, so it's got piles of old rocks and bird bones that are being glued back together and made to look like a bird again. If you're into that sort of stuff, then go and check it out, but that's not really my bag. What is really cool up there, though, is the behind the statue of Wenceslas, there's a tiny little memorial over in the corner, and it's a memorial to a guy called Jan Palach. Jan Palach was a philosophy student who in 1968 marched up onto the steps of the National Museum and covered himself in kerosene and burnt himself alive. It's just one of those days. Yeah, he burned himself alive. And what he was doing this in protest of the crushing of the Prague Springs, the Soviets crushing the Prague Spring. Now, what the Prague Spring was, it happened in 1968, and basically it was a period of softening of the really harsh communist rule that this city had to deal with. You've got to think of what the year it is. The year's 1968. The rest of the Western world, they're painting flowers on their buses and smoking weed and raging against the man and dishing out free love. All this kind of stuff's going on elsewhere in the world. Meanwhile, the good people of Prague are still lining up in the snow to get their bread rations from the mean old Russians. A guy called Alexander Dubček comes into power, and he must have been listening to a bit of the Beatles. He thinks, I am the walrus, and he decides to make some changes. So what he does, 3 major changes. First one is freedom. Freedom to speak ill of the government. So basically freedom of speech. The second one is freedom of media, and the third one, freedom of travel. So if you're trying to run a communist regime, these are 3 very, very bad changes. Because 1, people can go to other countries and see how pleasant things are there. 2, they can come back and get on the radio and tell everyone else about it. And then finally, everyone's allowed to complain about the current government. The Soviets didn't want that happening here, and they definitely didn't want it happening in other parts of the Soviet Union. So they decided to re-invade and crush the Prague Spring. They did it with the full force of the Warsaw Pact, which is kind of like the Russians' version of NATO after World War II, and included 200,000 troops, 2,000 tanks, 800 airplanes. So it's a pretty big re-invasion, yeah? And in modern history, the Czechs really, really don't like to fight. They're quite a peaceful people. There's a few examples where they put up a fight, but this definitely isn't one of them. In Brno, they make amazing guns. This country, they made heaps of Semtex, which is explosives, but they don't like using it. They don't like having guns at home, and they don't like fighting. But I think what they did in this instance is even cooler, and it gives you a pretty good insight into the cheeky mind of the Czech. I'll tell you what happens. At 12 midnight is the plan. The Russians are going to come in and invade. The reason why they want to do it at 12 midnight is because the Czechoslovakian radios are down. No one can get on the radio and warn everyone. They're just going to roll on in and have Prague taken by the morning. But they made one fatal calculation error. You see, in September of 1968, Czechoslovakia didn't use daylight saving like the Russians. So they actually invaded at 11 p.m. Radios are up, announcement goes out, sure enough, everyone's out in the streets, waking up their neighbours, getting out into the streets and ripping down all of the signs in Russian. That is, all of the signs except the ones that point back to Moscow. And then they get even cheekier. You see, they decide to rename every town, city and village in the country to Dubček. Everywhere in Czechoslovakia is called Dubček. The Russians don't have Google Maps. They don't have GPS. They've got some old map. It makes things a little bit tricky. Now, I'll give you a bit of a demonstration. In my mind, when the Soviets invade people, they sing in a funny English accent. And this is how it goes. You got Boris in his tank. He's driving along. He's like, my name is Boris, I like vodka. I'm in a big tank, off to take the checks. So he gets into this town. He doesn't know where he is. So, he comes out of the tank. You, where am I? Czech guy's minding his own business by the side of the road, drinking a beer. He's like, hey, you've just arrived in Dubček. But I don't see this Dubček on my map. You've been occupied, I will continue. Drops back down into his tank, goes a little Boris, Boris in the big tank. Driving along for another 2 hours. Realizes he doesn't know where he is again, so he stops the tank. Jumps back out. Yo, where am I? Guys, a Czech guy having a beer by the side of the road. Oh, hey, you've just arrived in Dubček. Dubček? I have been in my tank for 2 hours and I was already in Dubček. What is going on here? I think you're messing with me. You've been occupied. So he drops down into the tank, gets on the phone to his mate Victor, driving another tank. He's like, Victor, where are you? Victor's like, ah, hello Boris. I have just taken the city of Dubček. The city of Dubček has fallen around me. It's like, you can't be in Dubček, I'm in Dubček, it's a tiny little village. No, Boris, Dubček is huge, I've just taken it. Okay, see you, Victor. Now Boris is a little bit angry because he realizes something a bit vicious going on. So he goes and grabs the Czech guy, he's like, where am I, where am I? He's like, Dubček, Dubček, where is Prague, where is Prague? I don't know where Prague is. Where is the main city? The guy's like, oh, you mean Big Dubček. Well, eventually they did make it to Big Dubček and they crushed it. It took them 3 days to do it though. You can drive from one side of this country to the other in under a day. And the Russians got so frustrated by it that in the end they were just airlifting the tanks into the airport. And quite a funny thing happens there too. I just learned this story the other day from my Czech mother-in-law. When the Russians came in 1968, the Prague airport was a very, very modern one. They just installed something very fancy. It was glass doors that open and close like this with a remote sensor. The Soviets had never seen one before. They're coming out like Boris again, why not? He's on comrades, they appear to have installed some sort of big glass biting mouth at the airport. What do I do? Shoot at Boris. So sure enough, Boris and his buddies opened fire with automatic weapons on this thing and shoot the door down. But they came in and they did re-invade and they did crush it. What happens after this is a period called normalization. So what the Soviets call it, basically it's removing all of the reforms, increased spying and increased control. Very terrible time. Dubček, he gets sent off to Moscow for a bit of re-education. He comes back and he's allowed to rule again for 8 more months, but then they introduce a Soviet hardliner. Really, really terrible period for the city. From 1968 to 1989, it's very difficult to find a picture of Prague, a photograph of Prague that doesn't have a Russian tank or Soviet soldiers in it somewhere. And the Russian rule of this city was absolutely savage. Now we'll go back to September of '68 though. You see, the Russians have come in and re-invaded, and in an amazing incidence of timing, 2 months later, we've got the World Ice Hockey Championships. And tiny, tiny, tiny little Czechoslovakia defeats the Soviet Union, the USSR, in the ice hockey. It's not the final, but it doesn't need to be. This place goes absolutely insane. 150,000 people pile into this square. They've got Czechoslovakian face paint flags on their back. They're drinking beer, they're drinking Slivovitze. It starts to get a little bit violent. Little scuffles start to break out with the police until finally the Soviets see this as an opportunity. What they do, they smuggle in agent provocateurs and they stir up a bit of trouble. They get the Czechs and the Slovaks to attack the Russian Aeroflot building and use this as justification for a savage reprisal. They crush the spirit of freedom out of Prague, well and good for now. But it comes back, and in 1989, this square was the scene for the massive peaceful demonstrations of the Velvet Revolution. 2 years after the Velvet Revolution, the Russians finally left in the end of 1990, and all of that happened right here in the Prague New Town Square. As we're heading around here, you're going to notice there's all kinds of different architecture side by side, because this place didn't get bombed into the ground like everywhere else in Europe. We've got, modern commercial buildings. This one over here, the Corona. Corona means crown in Czech. It's got a crown on the top. This one's show you a good Art Nouveau one around the corner. Over here behind me with the statues on the roof, this one is a good example of neoclassical architecture. I'll show you a better one of neoclassical architecture. Then we've got another modern one in New Yorker, ugly building. Where the New Yorker is used to be the wall that surrounds